Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, October 5th. I almost said September, but the time is flying. Thursday, October 5th, 2023. The great Alastер Kruk joins us now from the hills outside of Rome, Italy. Alastер, always a pleasure, of course. Thank you for joining us. You wrote an interesting piece lately. All your pieces are interesting, but the most recent one quotes the head of Ukraine intelligence making comments like the Russians are not even humans. Reminded me, of course, of the Nazi ideology and attitude about the Jewish people and other people. Is this true? Is this a prevalent attitude amongst elites in Ukraine that the Russians are not humans?
Yes, it is, and it's taught in the schools. And it goes back really to the time at which the Banderites were essentially in the Wehrmacht, in the German army. And so in order to make themselves, I think partly in order to make themselves more acceptable to the Germans, they devised this new identity for themselves. They said their identity was basically European, by which they meant it was derived from Vikings and was Germanic, and that their language was also Germanic. It was all untrue. They are Slavs, like the Russians, but they created this identity. And therefore they've come, and you hear this regularly from the head of the security bureau in Kiev, saying, you know, the problem is we're human because we're European, but those Russians, they're Asian, they're not human. And this was very prevalent after the Maidan, during the attacks. And you know, many of the civilians, many Russians died in those attacks after 2014, and they were very vicious. And they regarded them as somehow Asian and non-human, whereas the West Ukrainians believed they had this sort of European, if you like, background and European culture, and that they were therefore rather like the Germans. They were, if you like, superior because they were German and Viking, and of course there's no truth. The genomes and everything show nothing of that, and the language is really basically a dialect of Russian, the Ukrainian language. It's not something different.
But this is very, very troubling, Alastер. I mean, it is fair then, is it not, to say that President Putin is correct when he says he's fighting against Nazis and Nazi ideology? If this is what the head of Ukraine intel, and this is what Ukraine school children are taught, well, the head believes it, the school children are taught to believe it. Does the average Ukrainian, as far as you know, manifest such an internal, institutional, constitutional hatred for the Russians as to regard them as beneath humanity?
Yes, as not being human. I mean, they say that specifically, that they are not human. They are Asian, they come from the Mongols, they are not like us, and they are not human. And yes, it is. And it's very important also, because really this sort of fake identity system, cultural identity that it was created at that time, has been taken up by the West, by Europe and everyone else, who tends to regard Ukraine as an expression of European values. I mean, in the sense that, you know, Europe ends at the Nappo River, that the whole of the west of Ukraine is basically more European than it is Slav, or more European than it is in any way sort of derived from Russia. So it's very important because this makes it almost impossible to have a negotiated outcome to the war in Ukraine. This is just, you can't have culture war, particularly fake culture war, as the basis for a discussion. and Russia won't do it. And it's extremely bad for Europe to even try and do this, because it's fake, but nonetheless, some of this ideas of culture war between Europe against Russia has sort of permeated into the ruling strata in Europe. And we've even seen revisionism about the last war in Europe when they had the armistice day. It was very slyly being presented as Europe against Russia. I mean, it wasn't any longer Britain and the United States against Germany and against Hitler. It suddenly becomes, the European family. They call it the European family. They're careful not to say exactly what that means. It's the European family. We are again fighting Russia. And they were saying this, and this is how this sort of cultural deceit has slipped into the European vernacular, but it really makes it almost impossible. I mean, there will not be a negotiations with the Russians. They're not going to negotiate on that basis because they do regard these people, as you rightly said, they regard them as a form of Nazi.
Here's President Zelensky saying how welcome Ukraine will be and how soon it will be in the European Union. But I got to tell you, and we'll talk about this after we watch the clip, it's hard for me to believe how Europeans can welcome such a racial prejudice and animosity. But here's President Zelensky on joining the EU.
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці, українки.
I wish you health, fellow Ukrainians. October 2nd is a European and EU Day in Ukraine. It is a very symbolic day. You can feel what it will look like, what it will sound like, what issues will be resolved and how they will be resolved. When Ukraine fully joins the European Union, the EU Foreign Affairs Council held an off-site meeting in Kiev. All the foreign ministers of the member states, representatives of the European Commission, and High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Josep Borrell were present. It was a very productive and substantive meeting. We all know that it is only a matter of time before Ukraine becomes a member of the EU. It is very important that everyone in Europe adheres to European norms and does not violate the agreements. This is a clear principle of Ukraine, and it is important that the same principle underlines the decisions of all European policy actors. When Russian aggression is defeated on our soil, the very idea of aggression will be crushed. It is only now that international law can prevail. Only here, only in Ukraine, and it will prevail. We will be victorious. Glory to Ukraine.
All right, obviously for domestic political consumption, but A, how realistic is it that the EU would welcome Ukraine, and B, is this a stepping stone toward its entry into NATO? Or C, will there soon be no Ukraine to enter the EU and NATO?
More likely the last. But I just to add, I mean, I think it's yesterday they had a meeting, EU meeting in Granada in Spain, a sort of summit meeting, a big meeting of that. And there was big pushback against Ukraine joining the European Union from member states, big pushback against it. Lots of objections, particularly on what it would mean for the agricultural policy system, because Ukraine would actually end up by taking away much of the subsidies that presently go to other states, would be addressed to Ukraine because of its large area under cultivation. So no, it's completely 180 degrees wrong. They also had a meeting about weapons, and there was again objections from member states. So the 5 billion weapon program promised to Ukraine is not going ahead. Not at the present. There's no agreement on it. And then when they had that big meeting in Kiev with all the foreign ministers there, and Borrell was trying to suggest, oh, well, you know, there's 50 billion euros will be committed from next year. It's no more than a gleam in the eye. I mean, nothing has been agreed, and there's going to be a lot of objections to it. And indeed, you know, it's part of a whole package, EU package of budgeting. And so it's not simple. It's not in Borrell's gift. Any member state can object to it. And Hungary already has said it will not agree to this. And it's very likely it could even be Poland, or it could be also Slovakia if it forms a government in time. Because this won't happen anyway till the end of the year, beginning of next. So, I mean, they're not about to get a big handout from Europe. So, I mean, he couldn't have got it. It was 180 degrees wrong. I mean, there's nothing of that coming, which is why there's such a panic in Kiev after what's happened in the United States. And I still think this is so important because money is the key. It really is. When you said what was the third option, that they may actually, that the state may no longer exist. Unless they get a lot more, they have enough money probably to get them through till November, through October, from here and there. But if they don't get a big wodge from either the European Union or from the United States, and personally I think that's becoming less and less likely as a result of what happened with McCarthy and Gates's strong attack on the whole process by which America does its business, that all of its sort of bills are lumped together, are decided in the Senate, and you get this mammoth bill of some 2,000 pages long, and everything is in it like a sort of great big soup. And no one is able to then sort of say, but I approve of this, but I object to this. This has been badly handled. It's all up or down. You either accept it all or you reject it all. And so, I mean, for people like Gates and others, he says, what do I say to my constituencies when they say, why haven't you got money for this? Why did you approve that? He says, they don't have the ability to do it. I think it's a big issue. It's a big issue in the United States. I mean, here am I speaking to you from Italy, but I see it as a big issue in the United States, how to unbundle and therefore vote separately on the provisions for the next year, rather than have them all sort of put together, which of course suits the sort of uniparty in control. Not us.
I fully agree with you. One of the undoings, this is a little bit off our path, but one of the undoings of Kevin McCarthy was his failure to keep a promise he made that there would be 72 hours of time to study legislation, and members would have an opportunity to come to the floor and offer amendments. This piece of legislation, which was 2,000 pages long, as you said, the Democrats, for example, had about 2 hours in which to read it. You may know that one Democrat infamously, this is terrible what he did, in order to get more time, pulled a fire alarm in one of the buildings so as to delay the vote so that they would have more time to read it. I mean, obviously what he did was criminal and he should face the consequences. But enacting legislation that spends billions and billions, and the people voting on it never had an opportunity to read it, and never had an opportunity to challenge it, is what was Speaker McCarthy's undoing. The only thing he did do was to take aid to Ukraine out, and supposedly, we may never know this until the books are written, cut a deal with his Democratic counterpart, or the Democratic leader, and with President Biden, that another bill would come up, and he would bring it to the floor, even if a lot of Republicans objected to it, which would have the $28 billion more that Biden needs to get the Ukrainians, I think, through beyond Christmas and through the spring. Terrible state of affairs. I mean, isn't Ukraine on the verge of economic, demographic, and military collapse, Alastер?
It is. And, with what you've just said, and, I've got a lot of sympathy for what they're trying to do in this. I mean, American debt, the debt is going up by nearly $1 trillion a month at the moment. I mean, it's unbelievable. And so, we don't want to see a complete crash in the United States. So trying to find some way of managing, instead of just letting all this expenditure just pass through every month after month after month, every year, the same thing, same expenditures, always bigger, never smaller. I mean, it just can't go on forever, because otherwise we will have something really quite extraordinary happening. And that will affect not just Ukraine, it's going to affect Europe as well. So, it's an important issue that you're dealing with in the States. It's not just a sort of point of, minor importance. And on Ukraine, yes, I think that's absolutely so. I mean, everything is coming undone together at the same moment in many ways. It's running out of weapons. It's running out of men. It hasn't got the right equipment for the winter. It's trying to do its attacks on foot. Imagine in 10 days or so when the rain comes and it's all mud or snow. I mean, how do you do an infantry attack in snow, on foot through muddy fields? I mean, at the moment they try and run, but I mean, you just don't do that in the snow and mud. And then, really, then with the money, if the troops aren't being paid, they're already deserting in large numbers. I mean, huge volumes of desertions from the army. So it is coming undone in a major way. And without the money, I think it'll come, this part of it. I always make a separation. This part of the war, i.e. the conflict in Ukraine, I think will be coming to an end this winter. The bigger war, one between, if you like, the West and NATO and Russia, that is a conflict which may not be a militarized one in the future, but nonetheless, that struggle will continue on for some time, I'm sure.
We learned this week that of the depravity of corruption in Ukraine, that the soldiers are told to have cash in their pockets, because if they're injured on the field and there's more than one of them injured, they will need to bribe the medics to pick them up. And then once they get to a healthcare facility, whether it's a tent or whether it's a hospital in a city, they will need to bribe the medical personnel to care for them. This is, I can use the word again, depraved. This is about as depraved a species of corruption that I've ever heard of.
It's despicable.
It's expected and accepted.
It's despicable. I just think, this is why, this conflict is not going to go on for longer. Imagine the sort of morale amongst troops when these are the conditions. Imagine, have you the will to fight? Do you really want to go on fighting? I really don't think, I think it's quickly evaporating.
Here's former Secretary of State and maybe future candidate for president Hillary Clinton saying, Ukraine, you can't believe this, but she says it, you'll hear it in a second, Ukraine is not corrupt, Putin is.
When I see people parroting Russian talking points that first showed up on Russia Today or first showed up in a speech from a Russian official, that's a big point scored for Putin. When I see Americans in positions of responsibility talking about how, we shouldn't support the people of Ukraine, they're corrupt. And talk about corruption, there is the master of corruption living in the Kremlin.
What is she talking? I don't know how you could answer this. What is she talking about?
Well, to me, it seems the following. I don't mean to be partisan, but it's quite clear the Democratic Party is in trouble. Well, certainly the candidate is in trouble in terms of his polling and other things. And so I don't find it so surprising that she goes back to this old canon that they had. It's all the Russians, really. It's their fault. This is, I lost the election because of Russian interference in the election. And I think I think you're all going to have this coming back again. I'm sure as it gets closer to the election, she will be calling out, it's the Russians. They've done it. They're doing it. This is what's going to be. And I think it's a cry. It's a reflection of the fact that the Democratic Party is in trouble. It's not doing as well as it would like to be doing.
Is she manifesting this globalist view that they all think they have a moral obligation to reduce Russia and rid it of Vladimir Putin?
Oh, yes. I mean, they do have this deeply. And partly in that paper that I sent you, I wanted to try and sort of outline that some of this came, that America, like Britain, it was Britain who did it. I'm not suggesting it was America because we set up OSS and the CIA at the time, but brought in so many Germans into them. I mean, many, 4,000 Germans. I mean, this was just the intelligence. I mean, the scientists and others came. They all found a home in Europe. But they bring with them their prejudices about Russia. I mean, they've been fighting Russia, in 2 major wars. They've lost many men. They've been destroyed by it. You couldn't expect them to be favorably disposed towards Russia at all when they came after the war and after having been defeated and were, if you like, assimilated into the Western intelligence structures, because they had intelligence, of course, and they had sources, like the Ukrainians in Eastern Europe, who said they had intelligence about Russia. The fact is that, unfortunately, much of that intelligence was really corrupted.
The CIA was founded in 1947. Present at its creation and there to fortify it, correct me if I'm wrong, were former SS officers welcomed with open arms.
Yes. I mean, not all of them were war criminals, of course, but there were huge numbers of German SS and the intelligence apparatus. He brought with him Reinhard Gehlen brought with him a whole system, which then soon became about 4,000 men, and about the same number of sort of sources that he had in Ukraine and Eastern Europe and others, and a lot of money, a big budget from the CIA. And, in a sense, he was always peddling that Russia is weak, Russia is going to fail. And he peddled this to Hitler directly during the Stalingrad and said, don't worry, they're too weak. The Russians are too weak. They can't succeed. There's no way they're going to succeed. They're weak. They haven't the ability to put together an effective force. And I'm not saying he brought all that, but much of it. And, unfortunately, it sort of ran counter to the American tradition, what I call the Pat Buchanan tradition, of avoiding military entanglements, by and large. I mean, it wasn't isolationist, but it was keeping out, and particularly keeping out of European wars. I mean, this was a major tradition in America, my understanding, and then that was completely displaced by this new, if you like, the sort of sense of Russia as the existential enemy. Churchill supported that, pushed it hard, too.
Yeah. Last question. I've been making some fun of Prime Minister Sunak this week because of a particularly British phrase that he used. The defense minister alluded to the potential presence of British troops on the ground in Ukraine. Unclear if he meant in uniform and with weapons, or like some of the Americans, they're out of uniform and so-called advisors. But Prime Minister Sunak immediately, when he sensed the pushback, said, well, we don't mean to do it, quote, in the here and now, close quote.
Yes.
What does that mean? Does that mean he can do it next week?
You're dead right. It means anytime. I mean, it's either we don't intend to do it now, or we don't intend to do it at all, but we might do it at some point. So it gives it complete flexibility. But
I'll let you go. Alistair, thank you very much. Always a pleasure. Breathe some good, fresh Italian air to get rid of that cough. We'll see you next week.
Thank you very much. Bye.
All the best. Thank